Thank you all so much for coming. We had a little bit of a bet. I'm looking around the room, and I know most of you. But my name is Hadar Harris. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. We had a little bet in a pre-meeting before today's event about how many people there would be here, because we are up against drones, we're up against gun control, we're up against finals, and we're up against a rainy Thursday. So we figured that a burrito bar and genocide could draw a lot of people, but we weren't sure how many, and so we thank you all for coming today. Before I introduce the event itself, I do want to tell you about a few other opportunities we have for you to have lunch before you really get into finals. Or that you could have drinks this afternoon, because we're already feeding you lunch today. This evening, at 4 o'clock in room 603, we have a really interesting panel with representatives of the government of Uruguay speaking together with members of our faculty about human rights in Uruguay in the 21st century. There's a very interesting history of human rights in Uruguay and very interesting developments that are taking place right now. As some of you might know, Uruguay just passed a same-sex marriage law a couple of days ago. They have established a national human rights institution, which is 1 year old, that one of our alums actually is a member of. And certainly that's better than the United States has done. We don't have a national human rights institution, nor do we in many states have same-sex marriage. So Uruguay is out ahead. At the same time, Uruguay has an amnesty law that's just been passed that really impedes prosecution of human rights abuses in the past, and so there's a tension of back and forth. This afternoon, we have representatives of the National Human Rights Institution, of the Ministry of Education responsible for human rights education, the ambassador of the the ambassador of Uruguay to the United States, the special rapporteur on torture, who just conducted a follow-up visit to Uruguay. It should be a very interesting event. So this afternoon at 4 o'clock in room 603, there'll be a reception to follow. On Monday, we'll have a day-long conference starting at 10 o'clock in room 603, also about our local human rights lawyering project. This is a project that tries to normalize and integrate human rights in the domestic work of U.S. poverty lawyers, legal aid attorneys, people who are working with indigent clients. This is something that Lauren Bartlett
and also
public defenders. Lauren Bartlett, who is our project director, has spearheaded this for us. And we'll be having a whole bunch of different legal aid attorneys here and people who are interested in this topic. The event will be from 10 till about 5 o'clock in room 603 on Monday. Also on Monday, we have a reception to celebrate and to really honor the tremendous work of the Human Rights Brief. And it provides me with an excellent introduction to our event today. As many of you know, the Human Rights Brief is a publication of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. It is now in its 20th volume. It's something that has certainly come far from being a very brief brief to being something that is a little less brief than it used to be. But it is a publication that is run by students, that is edited by students, but that brings articles and analysis and pieces from really noted practitioners from all over the world. This issue, which if you haven't seen it, you should pick up on the table over there. It's the latest issue of the brief. It's focused on the future of the Inter-American human rights system. And it's a who's who of people who have submitted articles that have been published in the brief. Many of you sitting in the room, I know, have worked on the brief and have contributed to not just this publication, but hrbrief.org, the online organ of the Human Rights Brief. And several weeks ago, as this trial started in Guatemala to prosecute not just the former president of Guatemala, but also his compadres. Right? Okay. I've been in a meeting with the Uruguayans all day, so I've been listening to Spanish all day. As the gringuita here, we were approached and asked to send a delegation to Guatemala to observe the trial. This trial is something new and different. It's the domestic prosecution of a former head of state for the crime of genocide. It's the first time this has ever happened. And yet Guatemala is a really complicated place. I mean, as you're about to hear, it's getting more complicated by the moment. In fact, we're not even sure what's happened in the last 5 minutes since we last looked at the Twitter updates from the courtroom. You'll hear in a minute what's been happening this morning. We were very fortunate, we are fortunate, all of us, that we live within an institution here that prioritizes practical human rights work. We asked for and were given resources to be able to send a delegation down to Guatemala to be able to observe the trial with the clear understanding that what they were going to do was going to be publicized to the world through the outlet of the Human Rights Brief and hrbrief.org. I want to note right now the tremendous work that the team that has been working with the Human Rights Brief has been doing. We'll note in a moment Christina and Ali's trip to Guatemala, but behind them were teams from the UNROW Impact Litigation Clinic and from the Human Rights Brief who literally were up all night helping to create and to post analysis, really different kinds of analysis about that trial than anything that's out there today. So I want to acknowledge and thank those of you who worked on this. Can you raise your hand? Those of you who are up late at night, Drew, Lauren, everybody. And thank you all for the tremendous efforts that you have made and that you are going to continue to make, whether you know it or not, over the next few weeks. We wanted to use this opportunity now to bring back to our community what Ali and Christina observed and have been playing a significant role in their time in Guatemala. Christina Fetterhoff is a 2L. She is the co-editor-in-chief with Matt Lopez of the Human Rights Brief. She traveled to Guatemala together with Ali Beydoun, who is an international human rights attorney and is the supervising attorney of the UNROW Impact Litigation Clinic. How was that? That was good.
Awesome.
Huh? All right, very few people get that right. Huh? And it was really our privilege to be able to send them down and to have them check in with us every morning and every night to let us know that they were safe and to see their reports from the field. Without further ado, I want to hand it over to them so that they can bring us up to speed with what they saw, what they observed, and the significance of this really very important trial for international justice and domestic prosecutions of genocide. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'm Ali Beydoun. I work with the UNROW Human Rights Impact Litigation Clinic. First of all, I want to thank HR Brief for inviting me to come down on this really historic and tremendous trip to Guatemala to watch, for the first time ever, a domestic trial regarding the charge of genocide. It was really a spectacular event. A lot remains to be seen and to be played out. But the most amazing part for me was walking into that courtroom, and I think because I've never seen something like this before, because there's never been anything like this before. And I've always thought of myself as student / activist / lawyer. And it was amazing to walk in and watch this trial and to see how each one of those different facets of myself was intrigued. I mean, as an activist, to walk into that courtroom and to look around at what was happening was very inspiring. I remember being 16 years old when I first heard about what was happening in Guatemala at some Amnesty International event. And it seemed so far away, but yet so shocking that this genocide was happening to the Ixchel Mayan people. And to walk into a court, and that was 1986, so to walk into a courtroom in 2013 and to watch accountability and justice because of those events really brought me back. And I was quite an activist at 16, by the way. Also to look around that courtroom and to see all these amazing heroes of mine, Rigoberta Menchú, who the Nobel Prize laureate from 1992 for her work on Guatemala, to see Kate Doyle from National Security Archives, the woman who brought Operation Plan Sofia, which was the Guatemalan government's military campaign of genocide against the Ixchel people, the Ixchel Mayan people, to see all different people from all different NGOs around the world here at the trial, or there at the trial with us, was really amazing, and it really spoke to the activist in me. It spoke to the student in me, the student who walks into to a situation and really tries to absorb what's going on, to watch the Guatemalan domestic trial system, which is a code-based system, to see how the procedure operates, to see what they have established to be a civil, or I should say a criminal procedure. It really spoke to the student in me. And then it spoke to the lawyer in me, to somebody who's been trying to bring cases against war criminals in the United States, who struggles with a very difficult civil procedure in trying to do that. To watch what was happening in this courtroom as a lawyer was fascinating to me. But this is where I may cause some controversy. I wonder if this trial is working towards being a success and a model, or if it's being polluted by a lot of what I'm going to call funny business going on. And Hadar just mentioned some of it, but just to give you guys some ideas to what's been going on, so far the defense has changed its attorneys at least 3 times. The defense walked into court on the first day and wanted to submit its evidence for the first time there. The nonsense that we're seeing in this courtroom and the way that the judges keep steamrolling over some of this nonsense really makes you question if the procedure is something that needs to be focused on a little bit more. And I said this in an earlier meeting today, that you have defense attorneys and you have prosecution attorneys, and both sides want justice. Prosecution wants justice for the state and for the victim. And a lot of times they're willing to take advantage of sympathies, they're willing to take advantage of publicity, they're willing to take advantage of prejudices that people walk into a courtroom with against a defendant. A defense counsel, and I was defense counsel most of my life, we see justice in the system. We see justice in a pure, fair, balanced system. And a lot of times we seek those rules that may be considered technicalities by the general public, but are there to ensure a fair system, and sometimes those rules hide very important evidence. And what we're seeing in this trial is both sides taking advantage of both of those things. Just this morning, for example, defense counsel walked in and asked for the trial to be ended, asking that this trial not go any further, that the judge suspend all further debate. What we also saw this morning was the president of Guatemala sign on to a letter that included about 10 other parties and entities asking for the court to institute a 1986 amnesty law to protect Rios Montt from any sort of conviction that may come out of this trial. And then even a little bit after that today, there's more. The Supreme Court of Justice issued a ruling. What were they asking for? They were asking for the amnesty for the suspension of the trial, which may be what we're seeing happening right now. Again, there's a lot to fear when we talk about this trial being a model for other trials, but there's also a lot that can be worked on and used to advance this trial. With that said, I want to get back to this idea that I was really learning a lot in terms of being a lawyer here. And I think in terms of watching this trial happen, I kept wondering, as an international human rights lawyer, how the United States can sort of use this as a model. And I think a very relevant part of this is that this tribunal is happening in some ways as not only Guatemala using accountability and justice to seek some sort of peace in its society, but also as a fulfillment of its obligations under international law. And I think that for those of you who want to go out into the world post-AU-WCL and be human rights lawyers, it really has to be on a rule of law basis. I think human rights works best when you don't try to overthrow, the laws that exist and try to institute new laws, because that's a revolution. But when you try to use rule of law and try to strengthen international law and those protections that are already in place. And I think as an international community of human rights lawyers, we really have to promote that. We have to promote that there are obligations that Guatemala is trying to fulfill right now. There's issues with the procedures, and we have to sort of pay attention to that too and make sure that the trial proceeds the way it should in a way that's just and fair and can be used again in the future for all the other people that were involved in this. We also have to be thinking about how Guatemala can be a model in terms of fulfilling its international obligations. So I think that's important for all of us to keep in mind. What will happen to Rios Montt, I think, is very important for the future of Guatemala. I think this could be a very difficult situation if the president actually continues to interfere, if the judge doesn't, if the judge is unable to control this, and it could be because of things beyond her control. And believe me, she's really doing her best to try to manage this courtroom and make sure that this trial is one that's fully open. But it may not happen. But this could actually set things back in Guatemala in a way that's very significant, and in a way that requires us, again, as an international community of human rights lawyers, to really be aware of what's going on, to educate each other, not only within our own institution, but outside of this institution, to pay attention to what's going on in Guatemala. This is what we do. You know, this is why you're all probably in this room right now, because you are interested and you do want to pay attention to it. But please, let's continue moving this ball forward. So I'm going to save the rest, see if anybody has any questions later, and I'd like to turn it over to Christina now.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to have lunch with us and hear a little bit about our trip and the trial. As Ali was just mentioning, I think both of us went there and walked into the courtroom wearing a couple different hats. I know for myself, obviously as a law student, also as a student of Latin America before coming to law school, as a human rights activist, somebody who's hoping that the victims of this awful period of Guatemala's history will finally have justice, and that, as Ali was also commenting, the trial will be fair and there will be justice on both sides, especially in terms of setting a precedent for future prosecutions. But finally, I went to Guatemala as the co-editor-in-chief of the Human Rights Brief. So I just want to publicly also thank not only my staff, but the students from the UNROW Clinic for all of your help and support during the time that we were there and before and after now. And I feel doubly lucky to have had this opportunity to travel, of course, and watch history, but also to have such an amazing group of people supporting me along the way. So thank you to everyone who's here, and please pass on the thanks as well to those who couldn't come. So in terms of what the Human Rights Brief did while we were there and what we're continuing to do, I've put up our special coverage webpage here on the screen, and I'd encourage anyone who hasn't had a chance to take a look yet to go and visit and read some of the pieces that Ali and I have written, as well as the background information that we had put together before our trip. We, with the hard work of UNROW and the HR Brief staff, we have coverage in English and in Spanish. So also feel free to direct your multilingual friends to the website. And then secondly, I wanted to share some photos that I took while we were there. A lot of them showed up on Human Rights Brief Twitter feed or on our Facebook page, but I think that some things are just a bit more powerful with the images. So I'm just going to switch over quickly to the presentation. So here we are in front of the main courthouse in Guatemala City where the trial is taking place. You can see they have a human rights plaza there. So we thought that was an appropriate place to take a picture. This is the main building. This is the panel of judges that are hearing the case. The judge in the middle is Jazmín Barrios. She's the president of the court that this trial is being held in, which is a special high-risk court that was established in Guatemala specifically to hear cases like this one. These are some members of the Ixil Mayan community. I would say about 350 to 400 seats were in this sort of auditorium courtroom, and members of this community took up not quite a quarter of them every day. So there was a very strong showing of members from this community. They're looking towards the the prosecution, listening to them question some expert witnesses. And as you can see, the one woman is wearing headphones. They had interpretation. This is some boxes of evidence that the prosecution brought. Every day they would come into the courtroom with at least 5 or 6 of these sort of giant plastic crates of documentary evidence. They all seem to be color-coded and different colors of files every day. So. This is the defense table. On the end is Jose Mauricio Rodriguez Sanchez, and in the middle is Rios Montt. Those are the 2 co-defendants. So the ex-president, Rios Montt, and the former director of military intelligence, and their attorneys, of course. Some more members of the Ixil community. I was really taken by their beautiful clothing, and I was struck especially by the sort of juxtaposition of these bright, cheerful colors filling part of a courtroom where so much testimony about such awful things is taking place. This is a presentation that one of the forensic experts for the prosecution put together. Had several slides with just lists of names of the remains of people that they were able to identify. There's Rigoberta Menchú, was very starstruck when she walked into the courtroom. And that's all. So I guess we can take questions, or if Ali was going to speak more, but yes.
Can you guys talk a little bit about what led to there being a trial for genocide at all? So maybe a little bit of the background about what went on in Guatemala. What did you hear at that Amnesty International meeting, and really the context of...
Yes. Well, I'll start the conversation, and then Christina's going to have to help me. Well, starting in 1979, actually it started before 1979 in terms of the insurgency, and I won't get too much into the history of the insurgency that was taking place in Guatemala, but it's a deep one. Through the 60s, many groups, many sort of what are at least the propagandists would call Marxist communist groups, started to grow in Guatemala. There were several different factions, but they started to mobilize and strengthen through the 60s until they came up with the manifesto, I should say, to bring an armed revolution to Guatemala, to overthrow the government and to establish their own sort of government system. And this was a very strong insurgency that sought 3 things: la masa, terreno, y poder. La masa, basically the dough, that I guess is what it would translate to, is how they referred to the people. El terreno, the land that they felt they needed to establish their government, y poder, of course, some political power. This was their platform. This is what they went after. Well, the government was paying attention, and the government started to formalize a way to sort of bring down this insurgency. And one of the ideas they came up with, which is further explained in some of the plans that they had, was to go into the civilian populations that supported this insurgency and to try to repress it in there. And they did horrible things. If you listen to the stories of the Mayan people, they will tell you that the military came into their communities, and for those people who survived the horrible massacres, the rest of them were brought into some sort of civilian vigilance patrol team, and these people were forced they were conscripted into the army under civilian patrol, and they were forced to work for the army. And the atrocities are just really incredible. And I'm not going to get into them now, just because they really are heartbreaking. Anyway, it seemed to be quite a struggle. And then in 1982, the government came up with 3 different plans. I've talked a little bit about Operation Plan Sofia. There was also Victoria in 1982, and there was one more. I can't think of the name of it now. But these plans talked about repressing the internal enemy and to sort of eliminate the internal threat. And Rios Montt, in his coup, when he took over, it's believed that he sort of ordered this. Well, there were horrible, horrible, horrible things that happened. The trial, in fact, is based on almost 1,700 cases of people who were killed because of their involvement in the Ixil Mayan community. That's why it's a genocide. And then, as the plans started to come out, through people like Kate Doyle and through people from Guatemalan civilian society, a lot of NGOs around the world started to take note. Now, the first case that was brought into a courtroom was not this one. This was not the first time that somebody brought a judicial complaint against Rios Montt and his compadres, but instead it happened in Spain, and it was brought by the Center for Justice and Accountability using the law that was formerly known as universal jurisdiction in a Spanish court. It was entertained there, but it really didn't get anywhere, and it wasn't until this case that we're starting to see the first trial on this matter. When you saw a prosecution table, you really saw 3 separate entities standing there. One you saw was the government of Guatemala, the Ministerio Público, who are bringing this. And if UNROW gave an award every year to the #1 prosecutor, it would be to him. This man was really incredible, very smart, sophisticated prosecutor, almost Hollywood-like cool. The other group was the FAFG. Now, these people are a foundation of forensic anthropologists and archaeologists. And if you guys give money to charity, please consider giving money to this charity. This is the group that went out there and exhumed the bodies. This is the group that went out into the world, found these bodies, and are literally digging up the clues that are now being used in court to talk about the crimes against these people. And the third group that was there was CALDH, which is a Guatemalan human rights organization based in Guatemala, of course, that sort of is bringing this. And between the 3 of them, they all got together, and that's who makes up the prosecution. Rios Montt, and of course, it's a domestic trial, and I think that's very important for a lot of reasons, but one thing that we could note about it, as I was saying before, is that it is Guatemala complying with international law. And, I mean, how many other countries are failing to do this? How many other countries out there should be having these trials right now and they're not? Again, not talking about the funny business that's going on, but as far as what they are doing, Guatemala does need to be commended for that. And as Hadar said, Guatemala needs to be commended for this trial, but also condemned for the funny business. So I think we just, as lawyers, need to be monitoring that to making sure that they stay on the commendation side and not the condemnation side. So that's where we are now. And again, it's the first time that not only a country is prosecuting somebody for genocide, but with the Mayan people, they've tried this before. They've tried using universal jurisdiction laws in other countries to try to prosecute these crimes, and it just hasn't happened. But we are finally starting to see it. And these things do take 30 years to happen. To talk about FAFG for another moment, I mean, to really think about what it is that they did, and also to contrast it to what's happening in Spain right now. FAFG is made up of anthropologists and archaeologists who went up into the northeast part of this country, met with the survivors of this horrible, horrible genocide, and interviewed them and worked with them to help understand what it was that happened, so that as they went and dug up these bodies and exhumed these bodies, they were able to piece together a story, the story that is the basis for this prosecution. The Guatemalan government has, I wouldn't say, been very supportive. They've been supportive, but not necessarily encouraging for them to do their work, but they've been able to operate in a society where they can sort of bring these stories into a courtroom and testify and bring their experts to sort of explain this. And I think it's important right now to mention what's happening in Spain right now. Most of you know Spain had a civil war in the 1930s. Its own government turned against its very own people and killed many of them for opposing the government, the fascist government of Franco. Today, we have forensic anthropologists and archaeologists who are in Spain trying to dig up these bodies so that they could bring the same type of lawsuit against the Spanish government for crimes committed during the Civil War. The Spanish government is so opposed to this idea that they have publicly stated that they will refuse to identify a single person. You could have the best DNA testing that you want, you could have the Pope and everybody swear that that is who they say it is, but the Spanish government will refuse to identify a single person, which will make it impossible to ever say there was a victim, an identified victim. So to think that Guatemala is actually not interfering at that level actually shows some support or some willingness for them to allow this to go forward. But again, this wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for FAFG. So they're sort of the forgotten heroes in all of this, the archaeologists and anthropologists. So please, if you donate any money to any charity, think about donating to them. And I'm not getting paid for saying that. So.
I'm curious about sort of procedurally where this is and where it can go next.
The context that I see it in is how I operate when I go to court. Meaning, you know, are there some good civil procedure mechanisms at play here? As I told you, it started off on a bad foot. It started off with the prosecution. And we weren't there on the first day, but what everybody tells us is, and what we've read in the newspapers, is that the defense attorneys walked in there with evidence. And they tried to submit this evidence the day before the trial. And the judge said no. The judge sort of moved it. And that was definitely, well, again, this is my view of it. It was probably a strategy. It was probably a strategy so that they could pull in other courts that they felt were more favorable. And they got that. The Constitutional Court did issue some sort of, I don't know if it's a decree or an order or an edict or a mandate or something, but they did issue orders to Judge Barros to follow. And having that in their back pocket, throughout the trial, you would repeatedly hear an objection from the attorney saying, Your Honor, you're not following the orders of the Constitutional Court. And Barros would say, this is my court, and you're in my house now. As a defense attorney, I have to say, and I've been a defense attorney for most of my career, I look for the justice in the system. And it's difficult for me because Montt was a monster. And I've read Operation Plan Sofia. I've read Victoria 1980 or 82. If he knew about that, and he had to have known about it, he admits to having known about it, then I'm almost willing to allow the rule to break. But at the same time, as a defense attorney, if we're unjust to him, then what's the point? And I always think of this one quote by Alan Dershowitz, the famous defense attorney, where he was once asked, would you have defended Adolf Hitler? And Alan Dershowitz said, well, yeah, and I probably would have gotten him off, too. And the day after I gotten him off, I'd take out my gun and kill him myself. And I think it's that thing where the first thing you have to think about is the system fair? Because if it's not fair, then what's the point? Today it's Rios Montt. Tomorrow it might be you or me, or you or I. It could be anybody. And I think that's something that walking in there with my, DC bar license and thinking I've done so many trials before, let me watch this system, and seeing this procedure that had these small little defects. For example, when the experts, the FAFG experts would testify, and the prosecution would ask them questions like, what's your background? Do you have a university degree in anthropology? Did you do any DNA testing? And if you didn't, how can you identify who this victim is? To have the prosecution object to those questions, to have the judge sustain those objections and say, you're not allowed to ask that expert those questions, in the courtrooms I've been in, that's what voir dire is. And unless the expert can answer those questions, you're not an expert, and you could challenge the expert's report. That wasn't happening in Guatemala. The value of that, or whether or not there's some nuanced voir dire that happens in Guatemala that I don't understand, maybe that's happening. But sort of those defects really made me pause and wonder, is this a model? And not to mention, I mean, from the prosecution side too, it's from the defense side too, what's this business going on with the president? Like, who made a phone call to the president last night and said, we're in trouble, do something, which results in this letter. It's that creeping sort of influence that will make all this a wash and make it'll set everybody back. So, yes.
All right, so I thought I heard wrong, but you confirmed it right now. Just a minute ago you said the government has tried to not necessarily obstacleize this trial, but this has drastically changed in the last 24 hours.
In the last 2 hours, yeah.
So the president is formally against this trial, and if it's so, how long do you see before this trial comes to an end, or do you see they could really succeed with these new realities? What's the situation?
I think that changes from minute to minute, and I think what we're seeing here is, let me tell you, right now the trial is in recess. As of an hour ago, the judge declared a 24-hour recess to decide on a defense motion to proceed with this trial or not. So a motion has been made, motion to dismiss, and everything's on hold, which is really out of character for the judge. The judge, like when somebody made an objection that required some sort of deliberation, she literally huddled with the other 3 judges. They'd do one of these, and within never more than 3 or 4 minutes, they'd come back with some answer. The fact that she's stopped this for 24 hours is troublesome. More troublesome than that is that this morning, the newspapers of Guatemala reported 2 very, very worrisome things. One, that President Molina actually joined in with 10 other people and said, give Rios Montt amnesty. The other thing is that the Supreme Court of Justice walked in and said, stop the trial. So, but Jasmine, I mean, if there's somebody out there fighting to make sure this happens, it's the judge, and it's probably her alone. So that's where we're seeing the struggle. It's not even between, the prosecution and the defense. It's almost between the judge and the president, or that's what's brewing. But it's very worrisome.
I don't think that the president has actually spoken out explicitly against the trial, saying that something is bad procedurally. But he has, on many occasions before the trial even began, publicly said that he doesn't think a genocide happened. And that was basically the statement he made again today, but in sort of stronger language, saying that if the trial does find against Rios Montt and Rodriguez Sanchez for the crime of genocide, then it will upset the peace that Guatemala has enjoyed for the past 30, 40 years. So a slight shift, sort of a movement towards more involvement, which is worrisome.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to point out that the president has been implicated by witnesses in the trial as having committed war crimes in his former role in the military during his 80s tragedies that happened. So he's been implicated by witnesses. So he has a role in the genocide and likely committed war crimes. And, so it's very complicated to have your sitting president
Right. In about the 3rd week of a trial, a former soldier who was involved in those massacres, testifying from a remote and hidden location on closed-circuit TV, did implicate President Molina as having knowledge and having been involved in the genocide. Which, again, it's you see this shift. One interesting theory, and I think, it's funny, you think the ideology, especially at WCL, is between the business people and the human rights people, but even the human rights people also have a division, and it's something that the defense is trying to play up. And it's the idea of accountability and justice and reconciliation tribunals for war crimes. And I know that UNROW has done some work on Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is undergoing a very difficult reconciliation process right now from the 2009 conflict. And several times I've traveled to refugee camps to try to interview Sri Lankans, and on several occasions I've been denied. And the people running the refugee camps who have to allow me in or don't say to me, you sow the seeds of hate when you come here talking about war crimes and tribunals. We're trying to reconcile these people, and you come here with this idea that people need to be punished and people need to be, castigated for the evil things that they've done. And what you see, and we're starting to see in this trial, is people think that having these types of tribunals actually reinvigorate the flames of division in the society. The second expert that testified for the defense specifically came in to talk about the peace accords and the peace negotiations and the peace process. And what he testified to was basically that this tribunal disrupts the peace process. And the peace accords were designed to sort of create a peace and ensure a lasting peace. And that tribunals such as this one and testimony such as that which we're hearing from the Ixtal Mayan people does nothing more than bring back this hate that the society has been trying to travel away from. And this is not an uncommon or unusual attitude. Think of Chile. Chile, you see, you have governments you have the continuum. And on one side is governments that deny anything bad ever happened. And that's the worst of the worst. That's like China. The other side, you have governments that want to ensure that everything can be done to bring justice and accountability for the people who have suffered, and they're willing to have tribunals and open hearings. I don't know if we have that government yet, but someday we will. But in the middle, you have different people that bring different devices. Sometimes amnesty laws are out there. Sometimes you have truth and reconciliation commissions that work. In Guatemala now, we see them traveling toward these tribunals, and that's why it's so important to see whether these tribunals could help. But you will have those people who say that this type of tribunal reminds everybody about the hate, reminds everybody, and it brings a lot of propaganda with it. And that's what we're starting to see now. And then the president's statement, it said, talk of genocide causes divisions in society, and those divisions can lead to another insurrection. So, yeah.
I was just wondering if you could talk about the public mood in the country, going off of what you're saying about this debate among human rights activists and activists. What seems to be the mood on the ground?
Yeah, this was something that we talked about between the two of us when we were there too, because obviously putting aside the members of the Ixtal Mayan community who are in the courtroom testifying as victims and witnesses, everybody else who was in there was from an entirely different world, whether they be international observers or the sort of, Guatemalan judicial elite. So we were really curious walking through, say, the Mercado Central, looking at crafts, like what the people selling us those crafts thought. But at the same time, we were loath to ask them, I think for a couple reasons, first and foremost being the fact that we were foreigners in their country and maybe it's none of our business, on that personal level at least, not speaking to the sort of the judicial process. And second, you never know who is going to be on the other side of that question, because there actually has been a lot of public support, not just from the president, but from members of the military, former members of the military, civilians, in favor of the two defendants. Not when we were there, but before we got there were protests in favor of them outside the courthouse. There's a petition that was going around asking for the trial to stop and advocating for their release from house arrest. And so it was a bit difficult to get a good sense of true public opinion just in the 3 days that we were there. And finally, reading the Guatemalan newspapers, while informative, I think anything that they report needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because there's so much politicking going on behind the scenes of all these papers that you can never be 100% sure you're getting the full story. I mean, of course, there's always some sort of bias, but there seems to be even more bias reporting on this trial. So that's not a very good answer to your question, but it's the truth.
Is there a general attitude in Guatemala of a superiority over the indigenous people? Why general Guatemalan
Well, I think part of the defense theory as to what happened is that to answer your question, no, I don't think there's necessarily a superiority there, but there is a desire to name somebody as the enemy. And I think the division you see here is the government trying to defend itself, of course. I mean, they're actually on trial. But they're trying to defend themselves to say, we didn't do any of these things. Maybe the rebels did it. We were trying to protect the civilian population. That's why we were there. Obviously, because they can't deny being there, because everybody knows that they were there. And then on the other side, what you don't see anybody glorifying the rebel fighters, of course, but you do see people wanting to point the finger at the government. I think the Islamine are just lost in the middle of that. I think that trying to define them as victims is not a problem. Everybody knows that they were the victims, but as to who the perpetrators were, I didn't sense any feelings of superiority or anything like that, but definitely a defensiveness as to being like, what are you talking about? We were helping them. It was a humanitarian effort. And there was just the defense expert who testified, I guess it was yesterday, where he said the most glorious moment was watching the Army helicopters come down into these communities and save these people. Like, imagine that. Imagine you witnessed a massacre. Like, imagine you witnessed what happened once those soldiers got out of that helicopter. Like that feeling. But
I would agree that I didn't have a sense of that while we were there, but I would disagree in general and say that I think Guatemala, like many other Latin American countries, has historically struggled with racism, mostly against the indigenous population. So I think that it wasn't an accident that these were the people being targeted to be helped out of the grasp of the rebels.
I was wondering if any heads of states of neighboring countries have chimed in on an official stance as to whether the domestic trial should be voted on or not, and whether that even matters, what they say. Speak of that.
I haven't heard of any support, and it wasn't until April 9th, almost 4 weeks into the trial, that the United States even sent somebody to go watch the trial. So, and interestingly, and this is again me, just the activist, one of the expert witnesses who was part of the military, who served under Rios Montt, who was doing the case pro bono, was trained to some degree here in Washington, D.C. at the military school. So, yeah, who left?
You mentioned the one soldier who came forward to implicate the current president. Have there been other witnesses who have also come forward to attest to these alleged acts? And what, Christina, you wrote online about evidentiary standards and the admissibility of certain witness testimonies, considering it's something that has been occurring over 30 years, whether you could give much credence or credibility to these statements if it's one individual or if it's several, and whether, so that's my one question. The second one is whether the government is actually fearful or that holding a government accountable for such heinous acts would allow many individuals to come forward to make these accusations, or whether they're just hiding behind the idea of command, responsibility, or whether I know many governments sort of give the excuse that it's a matter of national security, and so they are justified for doing such acts. I don't know if that's a question. Well, the evidentiary standards, whether you find whether there are many witnesses who come forward and to implicate the current president, and what you found during the trial, whether certain witnesses have backtracked on their statements, or whether their statements have actually held up.
I haven't heard of another testimony that directly implicated the sitting president, Rios Montt. So that's one part. But I think that, that finger pointing sort of plays into the idea of command responsibility, and he was a member of the Army during that time, and so you can draw conclusions as you will, but Ali is much more versed in command responsibility issues, so I'll let him speak to that. In terms of the evidentiary standards, I think that as in any trial, especially while we were there listening to the experts present so much forensic evidence, it seemed to me like the prosecution was partly just making a point that they could call any number of witnesses to give these lists and lists and lists of names of identified remains and talk in detail specific numbers of remains that had been uncovered and how many bullet holes they found in the skulls. And I mean, they got pretty graphic. So I think that just sort of the accumulation of that testimony was really strong. But the more sort of specific legal question of evidentiary standards, I think, is one that will need to continue to be explored because it seems a bit unclear how this testimony has been allowed in. And that may just be because the documents are not public. Like we were commenting earlier today that it's a little bit frustrating from our point of view that we haven't had access to a written copy of this expert testimony, for example, whereas if it were here in the United States, you could just go down to the clerk's office and ask for a copy of it. But I'll let Ali speak to the command responsibility stuff.
I think what they're coming into this with is they're sort of defenseless when they try to defend themselves against what the documents say. And by the documents, I mean the military plans. And I think they're stuck in this situation, which actually is advantageous to them, to say that there's no proof that Rios Montt actually knew exactly what was happening. And the expert witnesses that came to testify about the chain of command, they drew a very clear firewall between the president's office and his minister, like what we would call the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, and then the people that the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State direct and manage, and then you get into the military. And I think it's they talk about mando, like the power, right? And how the president comes up with sort of a broad plan to end the insurrection, to stop the armed rebels in their tracks wherever they are. And he'll issue that plan to the defense minister. And the defense minister then thinks about it and then issues an order to his, Army Chief of Staff to do something about this. And that's where you see the Army Chief of Staff working with the G1s through the G5s, which are all the intelligence people who are getting information, gathering information from the field, from civilian population, from wherever, and they're devising an actual strategy, a tactical strategy for ending it. But the information never goes back up the chain. Rios Montt, just using the people that were there in 1983, Rios Montt says, end this rebellion. And then the guy below him calls up the Army Chief of Staff and says, you got to do something about this. And then they start saying, well, I guess it means we have to go into these populations and kill these people. And that's where the trouble brewed. And oddly, that they say this, and Rios Montt is clearly firewalled away, but I wonder if then the other guy, Rodriguez Sanchez, becomes the sacrificial lamb, because he was what's called the G2, and G2 is basically a director of intelligence who would have been a part of the more tactical strategic plan to eliminate this population as a way of removing whatever safe haven the rebels find in these communities.
Do you find this as an obstacle as a human rights defender? Because I'm finding that you can hold these sacrificial lambs accountable, and then
Absolutely, yeah. In the United, I'm sorry, just to get into it. In the United States, our criminal legal system does not understand command liability or command responsibility. We only understand conspiracy. In conspiracy, there has to be an agreement to do the act, et cetera, et cetera. For civil, we're just starting to talk about command responsibility in terms of if somebody knew or should have known that certain acts would result in illegal or wrongful conduct, then that person could be responsible. And we see that in the corporate world, where some CEO makes a decision knowing what it probably means, and then the decision is carried out and it hurts a lot of people. Command liability, you have to be good about it, but you also, it needs some strengthening in the international humanitarian law field. Because right now it's either knew or should have known, or once you found out, failed to sanction or prevent. And that's a difficult standard. We've only really ever seen it twice, Rwanda and Yugoslavia, but we really haven't seen it too many other places.
I want to know if in the trial there is more evidence about United States involvement in the genocide, and also if you think it's necessary some accountability of officers, and especially the School of Americas and Department of Defense in this issue, because to be honest, at least we cannot understand the accountability only in the conflict without understand the geopolitics of the conflict. It was in the middle of the dirty war in this city. Mm-hmm. My question is more about accountability in a global sense, because many countries in Colombia, we try to deal with this tension between reconciliation and accountability, but maybe it's more broad in the sense the global operations in the Americas. Do you think is also some accountability here in the United States for this human rights violation?
I don't think so. I think what you deal with is, and we've had this in some of our cases, when you're dealing about international relations and international support for other countries dealing with insurrections or emergency situations, which is what they always call it. The Guatemalans feel that they had a state of emergency during the armed fight. A United States court has no jurisdiction over it because it's typically a political question. It's typically one that the executive makes, commanding resources to be sent to a country, even if they know what the resources are being used for. And this is, I feel, a very difficult thing about the work that we do. And we have to figure out ways to hold these people accountable. Because, to bring a case like this in the United States, you'll get dismissed at the first. You file that complaint, within 30 days, you're going to see a motion to dismiss based on political question. And it's very difficult for us to get past that. I'm not sure what the answer is other than trying to encourage other countries who have more power over their own people to sort of admit what happened, to reveal the documents that would help some sort of action to take place here. But typically the United States, it's deny, deny, deny. We didn't do anything. And once we reveal that something has happened is political question, the court has no jurisdiction about it. And then if we try to do it the other way, we would try to hold their people accountable here, especially a head of state. The Department of Justice will come in, give that person a suggestion of immunity, and then we can't even preside over those people. And not even to mention what happened yesterday with Kiobel. Kiobel, the decision as to whether extraterritoriality is going to be an obstacle to us bringing lawsuits for wrongful acts happening somewhere else. And it's sad. I wish I had a better answer for that, but I think that's the trend.
Yes, we have been talking about the trial, and I'm interested, what made Guatemala coming to trial? I'm thinking seeing it in a bigger picture. What pushed this trial to Guatemala so it can be replicated maybe in other countries and other contexts? Because I know you have been following. If you have any inputs in that.
I think we need to give a lot of credit, actually, to Claudia Paz y Paz, the Attorney General, essentially. She has been sort of the force behind this whole thing. Guatemala took the necessary procedural steps in terms of amending its criminal code, its criminal procedure code, but it seems like a lot of the political will is coming from her and the public ministry office. So I'm not sure, if that is a really good answer, because that's not a sustainable model if we have to just rely on sort of the charisma of one person and the determination, but at least they do seem to be setting an example.
And I think I definitely agree with that. I think it's the concept of heroes, right? Just people who want to do the right thing and then finding support. And I think Claudia Paz y Paz is definitely at the forefront of that. I think FAFG and the work that they've been doing for the past 20 years that brought the evidence, I think it's people and individuals inside Ministerio Público who said, let's go forward with this. Activists and NGOs such as Caldeache, which decided that we have to continue this. And like I said, it wasn't somebody waking up one day, and I don't mean to minimize it anyway, it's not somebody waking up one day saying, let's sue him. They've been trying for years. They tried in Spain, they tried in other countries, they tried to find some accountability mechanism to do this. And finally, one day, after many years of effort, somebody says yes. And then the door is open, the petition is filed, and every day, and look what's happening today. Every day somebody's like, is it going to end today? Is today the day they're going to stop us? Is today the day that all this is going to get thrown away? And today, at 1:05, I'm telling you, it's very likely that it could end today. I hope not, but it could. And then it's all for nothing. Yeah, we had our moment, but he'll walk out of that courtroom, go back to his house, and die a free man. And I don't mean to be disrespectful, but he'll never be held accountable for ordering the massacre of the Ixil Mayan people. So, and then we have to wait for some other country that has a Claudia Paz y Paz or has a Ministerio Público that's willing to do something like this. And we have to be, we, all of us, everybody in this room that wants to be a human rights activist, attorney, or student, or lawyer, we have to be a part of that, And I try to do that with UNROW, with WCL. HR Brief writes, it's what we do, and we have to make sure that we keep doing it,
That's why the international community building something up in case this case get dismissed.
You see, I know that the case, it looks like it could get dismissed. I know CJA is continuing that case in Spain, but Spain has just really reversed course with universal jurisdiction. And it comes with just, if anybody has a good idea, please hurry up and bring it to us. Yeah.
I just want to throw in two minor comments following the predecessor's question, because I think actually the part of the foreign publicity in cases like that is a big part of the whole story. And I agree with you that a national trial like that is a very important step and the first time in history. But universal jurisdiction, and then also the part of in that case, the United States being a part of the history, which is not being treated right now, is a major gap in the whole thing. And I just wanted to mention, I don't have her name, but I know that in the States there is at least one very well-known victim who tried to go to trial here, and which has been tortured in Guatemala in the 80s, and she could actually prove that American Secret Service agents were involved in her torturing there. And I'm not updated, but I think, as you said, the court did not
I think she was
make the case. But as maybe a positive example, I'm very proud to say that Switzerland just opened an investigation into one of Montt's Secret Service leaders, Erich Bereisen, which is now currently before court in Switzerland. And the prosecution just wanted Guatemala to hear the victims, and material has been processed. So for the first time, Switzerland actually accepted under universal jurisdiction a case from Guatemala right now. So I think universal jurisdiction and the obligation of all nations to investigate these kind of crimes is a huge part besides that national trials are important.
That's interesting.
Just wanted to throw that in.
And if you're talking, I think you may be talking about the case of Diana Ortiz, who was a nun.
Yeah.
And I just want to, we spoke with the lawyers from Center for Justice and Accountability who helped bring that case in the United States, and it was thrown out. That case was thrown out, but the defendant, the person that was accused of sort of covering up for the army, and the person that was actually named in the complaint, and was involved in her rape and torture, died from an attack of killer bees not long after. So maybe there's some justice in that. Who knows? But yes.
I'm just really curious about this idea of civil pressure, and if it would be fair to conclude that if it weren't for the organization and strategic coordination of activists and NGOs and different people coming together in very kind of targeted strategic ways, that this wouldn't have gone to trial at all. Is that a fair conclusion, or I'm just trying to kind of gauge to what extent that had an influence?
I mean, that's my opinion, I would say. So I agree with that, because you need three things for trials like this to happen in any country. You need political will. You need somebody that's going to open the door and say, okay, let's see what you have. And then once you're inside that door, you need evidence. You need something to show, some credible, legitimate, direct evidence. And then once you show that evidence, you need resources, because the other side's going to come at you 10 times harder. They're going to come at you with all, especially if it's a state. Yeah, they have all the resources at their disposal. So to sustain that, you need those three things. And that's what they had here. It was a perfect storm of the right people, the right evidence, and a political will to do this. We may see that changing. Again, please stay tuned to what's happening down there, because it's amazing. We're just not sure which way it's going to go.
Why is it stopping the United States that doesn't get involved in that?
I'm sorry?
And why is it stopping the United States not to get involved in that? Because they did it in a...
Because something may lead to them. Like I said, they've only sent the ambassador there on April 9th. I think the ambassador stayed maybe 1 or 2 days. The United States has not issued any, that I've seen, any public statements supporting this trial. The activist in me would say, well, the diplomat in me would say they don't want to get involved because they don't want to be seen as influencing one way or another. But the activist in me says, because something will be revealed. Like I said, when this defense expert said that he was trained in Washington, D.C. military school, and he was involved in the 1980s under Rios Montt, it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder, what was he trained in, and what was he trained to do, and did he leave the United States with specific orders or anything like that? We don't know.
I didn't hear. I was waiting to hear somebody say that they were trained at Fort Benning, though. And I, at least while we were there, I don't remember hearing. I heard a couple people mention being here in D.C., but not at School of Americas.
Yeah, it wasn't School of Americas. I think it was
the judges are afraid to prosecute this, basically this big high profile. It's because they usually come back to power. And that's what happened. They say, for example, I'm from Peru. You probably hear about Fujimori.
Yeah.
So he's in trial right now, and he hasn't been sent to jail because there is a possibility that his daughter is going to become an ex-president.
Mm-hmm.
So judges are very hesitant to put their fingers on because, hey, the next day they can be out of work.
Oh, and every country. This country, I'll tell you a story of a case we have right now in UNROW where an assassin during Operation Condor, who killed so many people in Chile, is being hidden in the Witness Security Protection Program. Spain right now is asking for his extradition to stand trial for crimes committed in Chile, and the DOJ is saying, no, we're not going to give him to you. And you wonder why. This man's a killer. This man's confessed to killing hundreds of people, and it's because of a fear that he'll talk, and people will come to understand what he did, and he'll reveal many secrets by the U.S. government. It's a strange combination of protecting horrible people for the security of the country,
Is starting to run a little short because I know that the catered people have taken things out of the boat already. And as we know, the urgencies of rooms and transitions. But I want to thank Christina and Ali very much for their presentation today, but not only that, the work that they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and again, together with the UNROW students and the human rights brief staff, to keep this visible and alive and to provide additional dimensions and analysis to what's going on in Guatemala. Stay tuned. If you are not following the Human Rights Brief on Twitter, you should. If you are not friends on Facebook with the Human Rights Brief, you should be. If you are not looking at hrbrief.org, you must. So you will stay up to date on what's going on, not just about this trial, but about so many other things. So thank you all for coming. This was so much better than drones, don't you think? And I just think that we as a community should be very proud of our community. And I want to say that in an official capacity and also, being grateful to Dean Grossman and to the school as a whole, but to the vibrancy of our community, of students, of faculty, of staff, who are working together to keep these things really moving forward. So thank all of you for your commitment and your work as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good day.